Today's scripture reading comes from Romans chapter 1, verses 19 through 20, and Psalms chapter 19, verses 1 through 2. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. This is the word of God.
There we go. That's good. I once taught a course in the history of science and technology with some other professors from the university where I taught, and it was back in the 90s, and the students were always amazed that I couldn't operate the VCR, So anyway, here I am. How many were here Friday night? We have quite a few. Okay, and so how many were not? Okay, good. All right, that helps me just to know. So I am going to repeat a story, maybe or two, but let me start with a story I told Friday night about a young woman who was a camera woman. I was doing an interview with media personality and author Eric Metaxas. He has a series of programs he does called Socrates in the City. And we were doing this interview about the content of my new book, The Scientific Evidence for the Existence of God. And as we were talking, this young woman who was operating the camera, stage left to me, started visibly weeping. And she almost sobbing. She was so apparently moved. We weren't saying anything emotional. We were just talking about some of the evidence I'll present today. And she later was so embarrassed by what happened, she wrote the producer a letter explaining that she had nearly lost her faith in college as a biology major because the professors were in her particular university department were so aggressive in challenging the faith of Christians in particular, but anyone who believed in God. And they kept saying that the science had settled the question. And she wrote us this letter, and she said, throughout my college career, professors would constantly lecture us that based on the evidence they had provided, there should be no way that anyone in class could believe in God. They'd argue that science was proven and God was hence a myth. They'd argue that the science, and I was not equipped to present a valid opposition in debate. I was desperate to find commonality between my beliefs and my scientific education, but she wrote, I could find none. And as she explained more of her story, she hadn't entirely lost her faith, but she'd lived in a state of what the psychologists call cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, there were the facts, and on the other hand, there was her faith, and she had no idea how to reconcile the two. And many young people faced with that dilemma simply relinquish their faith. And that, in a way, makes sense. If the facts are pointing away from the existence of a creator, then why should you believe in him? Well, it's not hard to see how many people, many young people in particular, but how many people in our culture might be coming to that conclusion, because there are very powerful voices in our culture that are telling us that that science makes belief in God untenable. And one of the most powerful voices of a decade or so ago now was Richard Dawkins, and his monster best-selling book was titled The God Delusion. But there were many other books in this genre called the New Atheist Publishing genre. And their message was, again, that science renders belief in God implausible or untenable or incoherent or something like that. Another book at the time was a book called Breaking the Spell by Daniel Dennett at Tufts University. Can you imagine what's the spell that we're under according to these new atheists? It's religious belief, right? And what breaks the spell is science. Okay, it's our scientific knowledge. So this was the perspective, it is the perspective. It's been widely conveyed in our culture, and it's had a big effect on young people. We've done some polling, and this turns up as a major reason that many people have rejected belief in God in our culture, as fewer and fewer people in our culture are believing in God. Now, The perspective of these new atheists has been beautifully articulated by Richard Dawkins. He has a talent for framing issues, and I actually love the way he frames this issue. We'll come back to it a couple times today as I'm talking, because it really helps us evaluate, well, what does the evidence say, and what should we believe in light of the evidence? And this is the test that Dawkins puts forward. He says that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Now, his phrase, blind, pitiless indifference, is very intentional, and it refers to the idea that that life and the universe are the product of undirected material processes. There's no caring being behind it. There's no intelligent being, no purposeful creator behind it. That life is the product of strictly materialistic processes. And he goes on to say that the universe looks like it should look if that's all that has been at work in producing the universe and the life that we see around us. So that's an interesting test and idea, but that's also, if you take that at face value on the authority of a great scientist from Oxford, you could see how it might undermine or have the tendency to undermine faith. Now, obviously, the viewpoint of Richard Dawkins is decidedly contrary to the view of the biblical writers. The reading today was from the NSB, which is a very tight and literal translation, and I noticed something in it I hadn't noticed before. This is from the NIV. It says the way Psalm 19 is translated here is, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, communication. Night after night they display knowledge. When we come back to this a bit later, the NIV translates this, the skies. The more literal NASB translates it, the expanse. And that's actually quite significant. I never realized that, so we'll maybe talk about that a little later. In any case, the biblical writers are saying there's something about nature that is revealing the reality of God. Not God as a concept, not God as a subjective experience, but God as a reality, as an objective reality, the evidence of whom we can all see. Romans 1 puts it perhaps even more precisely, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, sometimes in older translations rendered as wisdom, and you get this repeatedly in the scripture in Psalm 104, it says, in wisdom thou hast created all things. God's eternal qualities, power and wisdom, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. So the objective evidence of the observable universe reveals the reality of God. That's the biblical perspective. Now notice how that's very different than the perspective of the new atheists. And I suppose it shouldn't surprise us that the new atheists and the biblical writers disagree about what the natural world is telling us about the reality of God. But what might surprise you is to know that the founders of modern science, in the period that historians of science call the scientific revolution, when systematic methods for investigating nature were being developed, that these early founders of modern science would have completely disagreed with the perspective of the new atheists. They instead saw the evidence of God in nature. This is a front piece from a book called The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation. It was written by John Ray, who was the founder of modern botany and of our classification system that we still use today, that was later developed by Carl Linnaeus, also a devout, believing Christian. And Ray wrote, it was also the founder of what's now scholars call British natural theology, the idea that nature is revealing the reality of God. Now, what can you tell about this title? You see, it's almost a direct paraphrase of the passage from Romans 1 that I just read. And this was part of the perspective of these early modern scientists. The reason they did science, let's put it this way, they did science for profoundly biblical reasons. One of the key ideas that gave rise to the scientific revolution was the idea of intelligibility. The early scientists believed that nature was made by a rational creator who had imbued in nature principles of rational design. That's why they thought of things like the laws of nature. There was a law-like order, there was evidence of design, there was rationality built into nature. But they also believed that we could understand it because the same God who had made the order and the rationality and the design in the world made our minds, endowed us with rationality that enabled us to perceive the rationality that he had made in the world. And that made it possible to get nature to reveal its secrets if you studied it carefully. And so this was the inspiration for doing science. And then as these early scientists began to do that science, they also discovered evidence of that same rational creator. They saw evidence of design in nature. Now, great story. I only recently discovered this, that John Ray, the biologist that I just mentioned, went to the same college that I happened to go to about 400 years later in Cambridge, England. So I was inspired to learn that. But I also learned that John Ray was the tutor of a mathematician named Isaac Barrow. Barrow was also a proponent of natural theology. And Barrow tutored a very important person, Isaac Newton. And in Isaac Newton's great work on universal gravitation, published in 1687, he developed this theory of how gravity works, beautifully precise and mathematical. Several years later, he wrote a theological epilogue to the book called the General Scholium. And in it, he famously was describing the movement of the planetary bodies, and he explained that the law of gravity alone did not explain how the planetary bodies got in the right position to create a stable solar system. Gravity sustained the planets in that system, but it couldn't explain how they got there in the first place. And instead, this is what he said: though these bodies may indeed continue in their orbits by the mere law of gravity, they could by no means have at first derived the regular position of the orbits themselves from those laws. Thus, this most beautiful system of sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being, capital B. Now, I once was in a hearing in front of a group called the United States Commission on Civil Rights, and they were investigating whether or not there was viewpoint discrimination in the teaching of biological origins in public schools. And when I was summoned to testify about that, I thought, I wouldn't have thought you needed a hearing to establish that. Because if you open a biology textbook, you get only one perspective. It's the full-blown Darwinian perspective, and no other is taught. And so, of course, there is viewpoint discrimination. There's only one view taught. All the other views are excluded. And anyway, I testified and I explained the theory that my colleagues and I are advancing, which is the idea of intelligent design. My opposite number at the hearing was very feisty, and I made this, told of, in my testimony that I know what it was. One of the commissioners started asking me, well, this intelligent design idea, I know that people find this controversial now, but wasn't this the view of the early scientists like Boyle and Kepler and Newton? And I said, oh yes, it was. And so then I said, in fact, and I quoted this passage. Well, actually, first, my opposite number said, well, that's right, what young Dr. Meyer says, that these early scientists were very religious, but they took great pains to keep their religious ideas separate from their scientific work. And then I quoted the passage and said, well, no, that's not true. Sir Isaac Newton, in the General Scholium to the Principia, arguably the greatest work of physics ever written, wrote the following, and then I quoted this. And the commissioners, well, one in particular started smiling because I think he was on my side, and then several of them nodded like, oh, this might be a little more interesting discussion than we thought, because whatever you think of the idea of intelligent design, you can't, it's a simple fact of the historical record that the early scientists believed it. They believed that nature was the product of design, and that's why they went out to study it. That's what got science going. So all this begs kind of a question, which is, how did we get from Sir Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle and John Ray and Johannes Kepler and these great scientists who believed in God to this position in modern times where you have scientific spokesmen telling us, the general public, that belief in God is delusional, in the words of Richard Dawkins. That's a big shift. How did that happen? Well, there's a story behind that it's a story of history, the history of science. And in the 19th century, it turns out that there was a shift away from the theistic or Judeo-Christian foundation of science from the period of the scientific revolution, which is typically dated about 1500 to 1700. And by the 19th century, you have other ideas starting to come in. And there's a famous story about a French physicist named Pierre Laplace, who wrote a book called The Celestial Mechanics. And Laplace tried to do what Newton said you couldn't do, which was to explain the origin of the solar system by reference to gravitational forces alone. Whereas Newton saw the planetary system as kind of a setup job. There was initial fine-tuning, if you will. Laplace tried to explain it all by gravitation. And he was after the publication of his book, he was summoned to the Palace of Versailles to receive commendation from the Emperor Napoleon for his great work of science. But Napoleon was curious as to why Laplace had not ever mentioned the existence of God. And according to possibly apocryphal recollections of this conversation, Laplace was said to have puffed himself up and said, "Sire, I have no need of that hypothesis." That's my French accent, in case you're just waking up. Helps me to wake up, to be a little silly up here. In any case, we're not sure whether Laplace said those exact words or not, but it certainly captured the spirit of the ensuing age in science. Laplace tried to explain the origin of the solar system without any reference to a designing hand. In geology, great geologist Charles Lyell tried to explain the origin of all the great mountains and canyons and features on the surface of the earth by reference to slow, gradual, and completely naturalistic processes. And then, of course, in biology, Darwin attempted to explain the origin of new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms as a result of an unguided, undirected process known as natural selection. And in one of our leading evolutionary or biology textbooks today at the college level, one of the great evolutionary biologists, Douglas Fatumas, explains the Darwinian approach by coupling the undirected, purposeless variations to the blind, uncaring processes of natural selection. Darwin made theological or spiritual explanations of life superfluous. He had no need of that hypothesis, no need of the design hypothesis, no need certainly of the God hypothesis. And so whereas science started in a God-friendly milieu, by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, you have this kind of seamless story that the scientists can tell. That from the origin of the solar system to the origin of the great features on planet Earth to the origin of new forms of life, and eventually the Darwinian ideas were extended to explain the origin of the first life and the origin of human life. So from way, way back all the way to the present, you could tell how everything got here without need of that hypothesis, without invoking a purposeful, intelligent creator of any kind. And this gave rise to not just a scientific theory or a series of scientific theories, but rather to a larger worldview that scholars call materialism, or sometimes they call it naturalism, the idea that nature is all there is. How many here are familiar with the term worldview? Okay, few. Good, that's excellent. Now, for those who were here Friday night, I did tell this story, but I'm going to tell it again, okay? Because I know some people weren't here. When I was in college, I majored in physics and geology. And the reason I majored in physics was that my dad was an engineer. And I was not inclined to be an engineer. When he'd try to fix the car, he'd have me help, and I'd stand by with the wrenches, and he'd ask for a wrench, and I'd drop it in the most inaccessible part of the engine. And then he'd get frustrated because I was so impractical. I was daydreaming all the time, always thinking about something else other than what was going on around me. So I got the idea that I wasn't good at mechanical things, and therefore I didn't want to be an engineer like my dad. So before heading off to college, he took me aside and he said, "Son, I know you don't want to be an engineer, and you can major in anything you want to when you get to college. I would never try to make that choice for you. But let me give you a bit of advice. Before you make a choice about your major, make sure you take at least 2 years of college math, because if you don't have the math, you're going to be limited in what you can choose. So I said, yes, Dad, okay, math it is. So I took the calculus, I took the differential equations, I did all that stuff, and by the time I got done with the 2 years of college math, being at a small liberal arts college, about all I could major in was physics or math, and physics was as close to engineering as you could get, and I think that's what my dad wanted. So I was limited in what I could choose. So, but nevertheless, I had this interest in the big philosophical questions. I always had. So every semester, I'd sneak across college and sign up for campus and sign up for at least one philosophy class. And in my junior year, I was taking a course called Atheistic Existentialism. And this was the course about the depressing European atheist philosophers like Nietzsche and Sartre and Camus. And the purpose of the course was to kind of wallow in existential despair. And I was apparently very good at this. And I got an A in the class. So my grade slip came home at Christmas time, and my dad intercepted it. We have this kind of Germanic work ethic in our family. And so I'm in college, and he's still looking at my report card. And over dinner one night, he says, I'd like to talk to you about something. And I thought, okay. So he whips out the little grade slip that had come in the mail, and he said, you got some interesting results this semester. And he starts reading, and in the first grade is atheistic, and he mispronounces it on purpose to convey the idea that this is a worthless sort of endeavor. So he's atheistic, what in the blank is atheistic? And then he stops himself and he says, A. Like that's a bad thing, you know? And then he reads the next grade, which is theoretical mechanics, which was my most important physics class that semester. And he reads it, and there's a disappointing tone in his voice, B. And then he looks over his glasses, and he's got a long nose, and he looks over the glasses at me like this, which in our family meant, it is now time for offspring to give account of offspring's behavior. And so I get real defensive, and I start saying, Dad, look, I know these philosophy classes don't mean anything to you, but they're really important too, because it's in philosophy where you learn about worldviews. And like, everybody has a worldview. You have a worldview, Dad. Everybody has a worldview. It's like it's like a set of assumptions that you have about basic questions, and it helps you interpret what's going on around you. And if you don't have a worldview, you can't understand where other people are coming from and why they choose to use the words they use. And he cuts me off, and he says, son, you don't need a worldview. You need a job. And so we made a resume, and I eventually got a job in the field of geophysics, but later I actually got a job teaching philosophy, so I made it all work. But anyway, what I was saying to my dad was actually true, and now he gets a huge kick out of this story because I'm that dad with our kids, you know, wanting them to get jobs and things like that. So, but anyway, there is a default worldview in our culture, a set of assumptions about reality that are very well ingrained, especially in our elite culture, the knowledge culture, the people in the media, the university professors, the science laboratories, the law schools, the courts, the permanent bureaucracy in government. The scholars call this worldview materialism. Now, every worldview has to answer some basic questions, and the most basic questions that any worldview asks and answers is, what is the thing or the entity or the process from which everything else comes? Now, in theism or biblical theism, what's the answer to that question? If you're a Christian here today, you hold a worldview. It's the worldview of the Bible, and the Bible has an answer to that prime reality question, that question of from where did everything come? And it's God, right? And we conceive of God as a person, an intelligence, a purposeful creator who's active in the creation. God has certain attributes. And that's part of the answer. Now, the contrary worldview that's dominant in our knowledge culture, and that worldview known as materialism, has a different answer to that question. Instead of the universe coming from an external creator, the thing from which everything else came is matter itself. It's matter and energy, okay? And so you could invert the John 9 prologue in the Bible where it says, in the beginning was the Word, or the account in Genesis where it said, in the beginning God said, and you could give a materialist Genesis account, if you will. From eternity past were the particles and the energy. and the particles became more complex stuff, and that more complex stuff, those more complex chemicals arranged themselves to become the first living cell, and that cell evolved by Darwinian processes to produce all the forms of life we see today, and that living stuff eventually became aware. Oh, well, some of that did. Human beings became aware, and they could then conceived of the idea of God. Do you remember Sigmund Freud? He said that God didn't create man. Man created the idea of God, but not God as a reality, but God as a concept. Okay, so there is God in the materialistic worldview, but only as a concept in the mind of man. Okay, so does this worldview resonate at all? I mean, in the sense, do you recognize this as a thought form that's all around you and all around us in the culture? Okay, the bad news I have today is that is the dominant thought form among the people who have the power to convey to the rest of the culture what reality is. Okay? So this is what we're up against. If we're people of faith, we keep coming up against this way of thinking, and it influences all kinds of things in our culture. We have debates about abortion, for example. Is the fetus a lump of tissue, purely material, or is it a person made in the image of God? That's a worldview sensitive question. Whatever your worldview is going to lean you towards one or the other of those answers. And that's happening on all kinds of different issues. So it's really important to understand what drives these differences of opinion in our culture. It's deep. It's at the worldview level. Now, so anyway, when I was teaching, my students thought that I was a terrible artist, so they essentially forced me to convert all my visual aids to PowerPoint, and this is one we came up with to convey the idea of materialism. The disc represents the physical universe. The pendulum represents the laws of physics. The person being bumped along by the pendulum represents the idea in materialism that we're completely determined by those laws of physics, nature, and the environment, but also that there's nothing beyond the physical world. There's no purposeful creator. Nature is all there is. Okay, now that's kind of the bad news of the talk. If you're a believer, if you're not a believer, if you're a materialist, you may think this is very good. This is a very reasonable perspective. What I'd like to do now is tell you about 3 major scientific discoveries in the last century that are challenging this default materialistic worldview. And I in my latest book, I call this the return of the God hypothesis. And part of the story is fun because it starts right here in Southern California. There's a famous astronomer named Edwin Hubble. He's had a telescope named after him. Sometimes it's broken, which is kind of a bummer, but he was a great astronomer. And Hubble came into astronomy in the 1920s at a very propitious time when astronomers started building these great dome telescopes. And this is a picture of the 100-inch Hooker telescope on Mount Wilson up in Pasadena. It's an unbelievable piece of equipment, and it enabled astronomers, Hubble in particular, to start collecting, to viewing the night sky and to collecting vastly more light than other telescopes could collect. And with new photographic technology, Hubble was able to make a number of really mind-blowing discoveries. And the first was that the little tiny dots in the night sky that had previously been called nebula because they looked like gaseous smudges on a photographic plate, turned out not to be stars with a little gas around them in our galaxy, but rather they were separate galaxies. They were galaxies beyond our own Milky Way. And that was a new discovery and a mind-blowing discovery. And so here's some of his original photographic plates. There's a spiral nebula, spindle nebulas. These are just extraordinary, what he was able to discover. But he was able to discover something else about these galaxies, and that is that the light coming from these distant galaxies was being stretched out. You know, if you shine light through a prism, it separates into the colors red to violet, and the red light corresponds, it has longer wavelengths than the violet light, okay? Red is like this, violet and blue are like this, okay? So if you're analyzing the spectra coming from a distant object in the night sky, what Hubble was able to tell was that the light was redder than it should otherwise look. It was shifted towards the red end of the the light spectrum, and that red shift, that longer wavelength, indicated that the galaxies were moving away from us. Wherever he looked, the light was stretched out. So you know the Doppler, in science class, remember that if the train is going by and if there's a whistle from the train, the sound will drop in pitch. It'll go, and that's because the sound waves are being stretched out by the receding object. And it's the same kind of thing in space. If the galaxies are moving away, the light's going to get stretched out and it'll look redder on analysis than it would otherwise look. And so this suggested something pretty awesome, that if the galaxies are moving outward in the forward direction of time, I kind of visual aid here. Pastor, where did I put that? I was blowing that up before the service. It's in one of these pockets. I can play the absent-minded scientist here. All right, I'll do it without, you're going to have to imagine, I had spiral galaxies drawn on the outside of my balloon. But the idea is, that Hubble discovered, is the universe is expanding in the forward direction of time. Imagine the galaxies on the, drawn on here. Bigger, bigger, bigger. If the galaxies are moving away, the universe is expanding. That's the idea. But then what happens if you reverse the direction of time in your mind's eye? Because we're going in the forward direction of time, the universe is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The galaxies are getting further and further away from us. But if you think, well, what would the universe have been like 100 years ago? A little smaller. 1,000 years ago, a little smaller. 1,000,000 years ago, a little smaller still. 1,000,000,000 years ago. However far back you go, the universe is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller until finally you reach a convergence point where all of that galactic material would have been in the same place. A place past which you cannot go any further because everything's going to crunch together in the reverse direction of time as you back extrapolate. I'm still looking for that balloon. It's bothering me. In any case, that convergence point marks the beginning of the expansion of the universe, but arguably the beginning of the universe itself. Now, this was a really mind-blowing conclusion because astronomers and physicists throughout the preceding centuries had assumed essentially the materialistic story that the universe was eternal and self-existent. It had always been here. But now there's this indication that the universe might have had a beginning. Now, there was another scientist with particularly bad hair who had tumbled to this idea himself, but then dismissed it. He thought it was too crazy. And this was Albert Einstein. And Einstein, this is Hubble again, looking at his awesome galaxies in what's called the deep field. So there's this scientist named Einstein, and he has this new theory of gravity. It's called general relativity. And he publishes it in 1915. And the idea of general relativity is that massive bodies literally curve space. And there was actually an experiment that showed this was true in 1919, that light was actually bent as it went around planets and the sun and so forth. And so if gravity was bending space, that meant if gravity was the only force in the universe, then everything would collapse back onto itself and we'd be living in a black hole. But clearly we don't live in that kind of a universe, so there must be something in addition to gravity that is pushing the universe outward that accounts for the empty space between planets and sun and galaxies and so forth. And Einstein called that the cosmological constant, a constantly pushing outward force. But he realized if there was a constant outward pushing force, then there must have been a beginning. It must be pushing outward from a beginning. And he thought, no, that can't be because the universe is eternal and self-existent. So what he did is he fiddled with his own equations and he assigned an arbitrary value to that cosmological constant so it exactly matched the force of gravity, so that the inward pull of gravity and the outward push of the cosmological constant matched so that he could portray the universe as existing in a kind of eternally balanced, steady state was the concept. And so Einstein effectively discovered that the universe had a beginning before the astronomers did, but then said to himself, nah, it can't be. And then he fiddled with his equations to obscure that implication of his own theory. Well, there was a Belgian priest and physicist named Georges Lemaitre who solved Einstein's equations and realized that his fiddling didn't work, that the value he chose for the cosmological constant wouldn't work, that the universe was unstable and it would be dynamic. It would either be expanding or contracting, but we couldn't have a steady state. And he also knew about Hubble's work. So in a taxi cab ride to a physics conference in 1927, he told Einstein about this evidence and about his own work showing that Einstein's attempt to obscure the notion of a beginning didn't work. And so several years later, Einstein in 1931 went out to Mount Wilson in Pasadena to meet with Edwin Hubble to see the evidence that Lemaitre had told him about. And there's some famous newsreel footage where Einstein is looking through Hubble's telescope, and he comes out afterwards and announces, well, it's about a week or so later, he does an interview with the New York Times, and he says, I blew it. The universe is not static. Hubble and his colleagues at the observatory have proven that the universe is expanding outward from a beginning. And he then later said that his fiddling of his equations was the greatest blunder of his life. And he changed his mind and came to accept what is now known as the Big Bang Theory, the idea that there was a beginning. Now, there's a whole lot more to tell about this story. It's a fascinating story. And scientists throughout the rest of the 20th century tried to find a way around it. They didn't like it. And there's Arthur Eddington who actually told Einstein about some of Hubble's work. He didn't like it. And this is what he said philosophically. He was British. He said, the notion of a beginning of the present order is repugnant to me. I should like to find a genuine loophole. I simply do not believe the present order of things started off with a bang. The expanding universe is preposterous. It leaves me cold, he said. So this is a theory in psychology that is known as denial. Okay. Notice that Eddington doesn't cite any evidence. He just says philosophically he doesn't like it. He, like all the other physicists at the time, believed in the infinite universe. Well, why is this so troubling? Well, it was a great physicist at Princeton, Robert Dicke, who explained the problem. He said an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of explaining the origin of matter at any finite time in the past. Well, right. The universe has always been here. You don't have to explain where it came from. But what if the universe had a beginning? Well, then you do have to explain the origin of matter. And what's the problem with explaining the origin of matter materialistically? Before the origin of matter, there's no matter to do the causing. That's a head scratcher. That's puzzling if you're committed to a materialistic worldview. And so this was the problem. Now, the other thing about this is that this discovery ends up underwriting something called the cosmological argument for the existence of God. It's an old argument, and it goes like this. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause. The universe, we now know, began to exist. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. And since causes are separate from their effects, the cause can't be the universe itself. It must be something external to the universe. The universe needs an external cause or creator. Other thing about this is it reminds us of something, doesn't it? What are the first words of the Bible? In the beginning. And even in the New Testament, we get this idea where the writer of the epistle to Titus says that he talks about the plan of God, which was promised before the beginning of time. There's another epistle that also uses this phrase, before the beginning of time. So the Bible affirms that time itself had a beginning. Guess what else is telling us that now? Modern physics. I mean, it's an incredible and very unexpected convergence. Okay, let's, one last thing on this is one of the physicists who received a Nobel Prize for discovering some other evidence that pointed to the beginning of the universe and confirmed the Big Bang Theory. It was a physicist named Arno Penzias. He helped discover something called the cosmic background radiation. And he later said, the best data we have are exactly what I would have predicted if we had nothing to go on but the first 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. It's an extraordinary statement. In addition to in the beginning, the Psalms repeatedly refer to God stretching out the heavens. Okay, that's discovery number 1. Now, let's just quickly review Dawkins' statement. He says the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is nothing but no design, no purpose, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Can you see that the materialists did not expect this discovery? They did not expect there to be evidence of a beginning of the universe. So on this point about the origin of the universe, Dawkins is incorrect. Another big discovery, we'll go through this one a little more quickly, but it's something called the fine-tuning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the fundamental parameters of the universe, the strength of gravity, the strength of electromagnetic attraction, the strength of the cosmological constant that's pushing the universe apart, the masses of the elementary particles, the electrons, the quarks, and so forth. All of these parameters are just right. The forces are not too strong, not too weak. The speed of the expansion is not too fast, not too slow. The weight or the mass of the particles, not too heavy, not too light. All of these parameters fall within a sweet spot, within a very narrow range, or very narrow tolerance, outside of which not only life would be impossible, but even basic chemistry. You couldn't get stable galaxies or planets. There would be no place for life to exist unless all these parameters are just right. And it's incredibly improbable that even single parameters would be just right, let alone the whole ensemble. And so this has been a mind kind of altering discovery for many physicists. And one of the physicists who hated the idea of a beginning to the universe and he hated it for philosophical reasons. His name was Sir Fred Hoyle, a great British astrophysicist. He was a strident scientific atheist. He discovered a number of these parameters and ended up changing his worldview. And he was later quoted as saying, "A common sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology." I always like the way the monkeys make it into the origins discussion, even if we're talking about physics. Now, I didn't explain this little diagram, but this was a way of conveying the idea of the universe, of the fine-tuning, that you have all these separate parameters, and each one has a separate dial or slider, and they have to be set in just right, such that if you move it one click right or left, the universe collapses back on itself or expands so quickly that we get a heat death. So we're in a sweet spot, a Goldilocks spot. In fact, some physicists refer to the universe as a Goldilocks universe. It's so beautifully finely tuned to allow for life. Fine-tuning, says Hoyle, suggests a fine-tuner, and he changes his worldview, just as Einstein had to change his mind. Now, a third area of discovery that is, I think, bringing back the God hypothesis and challenging scientific materialism is the discovery of design at the foundation of life. So we're now into biology. This will be our last example. This is in the membrane of a bacterial cell. It's a little rotary engine. If you were here Friday night, I talked about it a bit. It's a nanoscale machine that's been discovered in a very simple form of life, in a one-celled organism. And it's essentially a rotary engine. It has O-rings and a bushing, a stator and a drive shaft, and O-rings and bushings, and a U-joint, and a little whip-like propeller that moves the bacterium around. It can turn, in some species, at 100,000 RPM, and change direction on a quarter of a turn and turns the other direction. It's hardwired into something called a signal transduction circuit that allows the little critter to get information about where there's more sugar in the water, and it changes direction and chases down its food supply with that information coming in to the organism. It's a high-tech device in low life. It's extraordinary. Now, my colleague, Michael Behe, from Lehigh University, who's part of Discovery Institute as well, has written a very famous book explaining why these little machines point to design, point to an intelligent design. I'm not going to unpack that argument. I did a bit on Friday night, but because I want to talk about an even deeper consideration that points to design that we can understand in light of how you build these machines. These little machines are made of molecules called proteins. They're huge biomacromolecules that are made of subunits of smaller molecules called amino acids. The amino acids are sequenced right, they fold up into a three-dimensional shape, and they can form the parts of these molecular machines. But that raises a question: how do the parts of the protein get arranged properly? The amino acids, how do they get arranged properly? And The big discovery of modern biology is that there's another molecule inside the cell that contains instructions for building these important protein molecules that do all the jobs that keep our cells alive. Proteins make molecular machines, they form enzymes that catalyze reactions, they process the information on DNA. They're like the toolbox of the cell. But how do you build them? Well, they're built in accord with these instructions that are on the DNA molecule. And these instructions, the DNA molecule the structure was first discovered by Watson and Crick, but then in 1958, Francis Crick realized that the DNA was literally containing instructions in a digital form. He called that the sequence hypothesis. You see on the slide here that there's the outer part of the DNA with the pentagons and the circles, and the inner part that has these chemical subunits that are labeled with letters A, C, G, and T. And the reason that chemists label those different subunits with those letters is because that's how they're functioning. This was Crick's idea, that these chemical, what are called bases, are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language, or say digital characters in the machine code, like the zeros and ones in a section of software. And Bill Gates, our software mogul up in the Seattle area, has said that DNA is like a computer program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. Now, that's a very suggestive remark, because where do computer programs come from? They come from programmers, right? In fact, whenever we see information, especially when we see it in a digital or alphabetic form, and we trace that information back to its source, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription, or a paragraph in a book, or the information in computer code, or information embedded in a radio signal, whenever we trace information back to its source, we always come to a mind, not an undirected material process. And so one of the great scientists who was working on the application of information theoretic concepts to understanding biology said that the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. And that suggests, therefore, that when the information that we find at the foundation of life in the DNA molecule is pointing to a prior intelligence. If it takes a mind to generate information, and that's what we know from our uniform and repeated experience, the basis of all scientific reasoning, then the discovery of information in even the smallest recesses of every cell of every living organism on Earth suggests that there was a master programmer responsible for life. That's the argument of a book I wrote several years ago called Signature in the Cell, and many scientists are tumbling to this position. So let's wrap this all up. What have we seen? In contrast to the materialistic worldview, which still dominates our knowledge culture, modern science has discovered three things. The material universe had a beginning, suggesting the need for an external creator. We've also seen that the universe has been fine-tuned for life, suggesting the need for a fine-tuner, and that this fine-tuning has been present from the very beginning of life. So no space alien could be responsible for this evidence of design. And thirdly, we've seen that there's evidence of design in life itself. And if you add that all up, I think the best explanation of that is the concept of God. God in the sense of a transcendent creator who is separate from the creation, who is wise and intelligent and powerful enough to bring the creation into existence, but also to structure it in a way that makes it friendly to life, and also a creator who's active in the creation, because life arises long after the beginning. So a deistic conception of the creator doesn't work here, because we have evidence of design at the beginning, but also after the beginning. And the materialistic worldview that we've been talking about can explain none of this. All of these things are unexpected discoveries, unexpected properties of the universe, given the Dawkins perspective of blind, pitiless indifference, in other words, materialism. So leading historians of science have started to notice that the idea that God created the universe is a more respectable hypothesis today than at any time in the last 100 years. In my book, Return to the God Hypothesis, I go a bit further than that and say that theism, the affirmation of a God with those attributes we've just been describing, the concept of God that we find in the Bible, best explains the evidence we have about biological and cosmological origins, the origin of life and the origin of the universe. So in conclusion, I would just say that we go back to that initial tension between the new atheists and the biblical writers. St. Paul and the psalmist had it right, and Richard Dawkins, I fear, has it all wrong. Thank you very much.